They called her Ghost. The nurses on the third floor thought it was funny how Natalie Hayes drifted through overnight shifts at Riverside Community Hospital in Philadelphia without making a sound, her presence barely registering until a patient coded and those scarred hands moved with impossible precision. She didn't announce herself. She didn't need to. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song against white tile as Natalie charted at 2:47 a.m., the antiseptic smell of the ICU mixing with cold coffee that had gone bitter an hour ago. Room for 12. Septic patient. Vital stable for now. She wrote in her careful script, each letter deliberate, each note forensic in its accuracy. The night shift had 17 more minutes of traffic before day shift arrived, and she moved through those minutes like water finding the path of least resistance, present but unobtrusive, available but not demanding. Her left leg ached. It always did after the long nights, a phantom complaint from the shrapnel injury that had ended her medical discharge 15 years ago. She favored it on the stairs without thinking anymore, her body remembering the calculus of pain and compensation before her conscious mind registered the limp. Nobody asked about it. Nobody asked about much of anything when it came to Natalie Hayes. A resident named Chen, fresh out of med school, nervous fingers, too much coffee in his system, nearly collided with her at the medication cart. The panic in his face was readable at a glance. He'd made a mistake on an order, wasn't sure what to do, knew he needed help but didn't want to ask the chief of surgery. Natalie glanced at the order slip. Morphine dose marked for a 67-kilogram patient but calculated as if the patient weighed 120 kilograms. Wrong patient or wrong math? She kept her voice flat, conversational. Not an accusation. Just a question. Chen's face went pale. I didn't. Fix it before you hang it. She turned back to her charting. Second set of eyes always helps. She didn't look up as he corrected the dose with shaking hands, didn't watch him check it 3 times before administering it to the right patient. The work was its own reward. The work was always its own reward. For 15 years, since the day the shrapnel took her left knee and ended her commission, Natalie had understood a simple truth: competence required no introduction. Healing required no credential beyond the ability to hold a life together when it was breaking apart. By dawn, Chen had mentioned her to 2 other residents. By end of shift, the night nurse supervisor was requesting her specifically for post-operative recovery. By the following week, 3 patients had asked for the quiet nurse with the scarred hands, the one who didn't rush and didn't flinch when things went wrong. Then Dr. Marcus Whitfield arrived as the new chief of surgery, and everything changed. He was the kind of handsome that advertising departments designed for, tailored suit at $1,000 minimum, teeth like a toothpaste commercial, the kind of cologne that announced his presence before his voice did. He moved through Riverside Community like he already owned the place, his expensive shoes clicking against the linoleum in a rhythm that demanded attention. On his first morning, he stood at the nursing station and watched Natalie calm a panicking resident with 3 quiet words, watched the young doctor's shoulders drop from around his ears, watched the panic drain from his face like someone had pulled a plug. Whitfield's eyes narrowed. Just for a second. But it was there. That resident, he said to the charge nurse. Who trained him on de-escalation protocol? He worked the night shift with Hayes, the charge nurse answered. She just has a way with people. Whitfield didn't say anything. He just kept watching. By the second week, he was asking questions. Pointed questions. Why did a nurse with only an associate degree command such deference from the medical residents? What gave her authority to suggest alternative treatment protocols to physicians with doctorate degrees? Had her credentials ever been formally verified by hospital administration? His voice was pleasant when he asked these things, his smile never wavering, but the questions hung in the air like smoke. The patients didn't care about credentials. The residents didn't care about degrees. They cared about the fact that when Natalie Hayes was in a room, nothing fell apart. When she was working a code, people survived it. When she made a suggestion, it was the kind of quiet observation that came from someone who had seen enough medicine to understand the difference between textbook protocol and the moment when textbooks didn't matter anymore. Whitfield had a doctorate. He had published papers. He had his name on the letterhead as Chief of Surgery. He had authority that came with the title, with the salary, with the corner office on the 3rd floor where the administrators lived. But the residents went to Natalie Hayes with their questions. He thought about that a lot, Natalie could tell. The way his jaw tightened when a medical student asked her opinion instead of his. The way his eyes tracked her movements through the hospital corridors. The way he listened to her voice, measured, never hurried, never condescending, when she explained something to a younger nurse, and then watched how that younger nurse listened, really listened, instead of nodding out of obligation. It was a simple mathematical problem in Whitfield's mind, and she could see him working it out. Real competence shouldn't require credentials or corner offices. If it did, then the hierarchy made sense. If it didn't, then everything he'd built his career on was a lie. Real competence didn't announce itself. Real competence moved through a hospital at night like a ghost, doing the work that kept people alive, asking for nothing in return. Natalie kept a tarnished challenge coin in her scrub pocket. She fingered its worn edges during the slow moments of her shifts, during the long hours when the hospital slept and she was one of the few people still awake enough to matter. No unit markings visible on its surface, just abstract symbols that looked like nothing to civilians, just the worn silver finish of something that had been carried through a lot of history. She'd kept it in her locker for 15 years, hidden behind the extra uniforms and the compression bandages for her left leg. It was the only thing from before that she'd let herself keep, and she didn't let herself think about why. The work was what mattered. The quiet work. The work that didn't require explanation or credential or recognition. 16 years of overnight shifts at Riverside Community. 3 weeks of Dr. Marcus Whitfield watching her with the patient intensity of a man trying to solve a problem. Then, at 11:34 p.m. on a Thursday in October, the emergency alert went live on the hospital radio, and everything Natalie had built for 15 years of invisible work was about to become very visible. Incoming trauma. Medevac inbound. ETA for minutes. The dispatch voice was calm, professional, the kind of calm that came from years of delivering bad news without emotional inflection. Natalie was in the break room when the announcement came, holding a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago. She set the cup down carefully on the counter. Multiple gunshot wounds. 5 rounds. Captain Joel Morrison, United States Navy Special Forces. Alert all available surgical staff. Level 1 trauma protocol. Natalie's hands went still. 5 rounds. Captain Joel Morrison. Morrison commanded the 3rd Battalion Element out of Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, the same unit where her son Daniel served as a combat medic. The same unit that Daniel had emailed her about last month, mentioning Morrison by name in a way that only soldiers used when talking about the kind of leaders who brought people home alive. Daniel had written, "Captain Morrison runs his men like they're his own brothers. I've seen him carry a wounded Marine for 3 kilometers in 112-degree heat. That's the kind of man you follow into a valley knowing someone might not walk out." The coffee cup was cold in her hands. The hospital corridor suddenly felt very far away. The medevac Black Hawk was already audible over the city, the distinctive thud of rotor blades that civilians never heard unless something catastrophic had happened. Natalie set down the cup and moved toward the elevator, her mind already sorting through trauma protocols, blood types, surgical teams, the 1,000 small calculations that happened in the seconds before a life arrived broken and bleeding. Her left leg ached. She ignored it. By the time she reached the trauma bay, Dr. Whitfield was already there, already positioning himself where he could be seen, where his presence would matter. The surgical team was assembling, anesthesia, 2 surgical nurses, orthopedics standing by. The ER doors opened and the paramedics came through with the stretcher, moving with the practiced speed of people who had maybe 4 minutes before everything became impossible. Captain Morrison was grey under the emergency lighting, the kind of grey that came from losing a lot of blood very fast. 5 bullet wounds. Entry wounds that she could count, exit wounds she couldn't quite catalogue from her position at the edge of the trauma bay. The paramedic was calling out vitals like a prayer to gods who weren't listening, BP 78/52 and dropping. Heart rate 142. 2 large boreholes running wide open. Estimated blood loss 2 liters. Natalie stepped forward without raising her hand, without asking permission, without the deference that the hospital had trained into her. She'd spent 15 years being invisible. She'd spent 15 years keeping that invisible right through her fingertips, into the work, into the lives that kept breathing because she was there. "I'm taking this case," she said. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact delivered in the kind of voice that didn't leave room for negotiation. Whitfield's head snapped toward her like she'd just slapped him. His mouth opened. Whatever was about to come out of it, the reprimand, the question about her credentials, the reminder about hierarchy, stayed locked behind his teeth when he saw something in her face that made the calculation change. Not anger. Not emotion. Just absolute certainty. The kind of certainty that came from someone who had held too many lives in her hands to be impressed by his title. "Volunteer for the case," Whitfield said carefully, and it wasn't quite a permission, but it also wasn't quite a denial. Natalie was already moving toward the surgical prep area, already pulling on gloves with movements that had the weight of muscle memory behind them. Captain Morrison's eyes were open, barely, and for just a fraction of a second she met his gaze. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. His eyes closed again. The work was about to begin. The invisible work that kept people alive. The work that didn't require anyone to understand who she was or what she'd been or why her hands never trembled when everything was falling apart. From his position in the hallway, Dr. Whitfield watched her disappear into the surgical suite, and in that moment, something shifted in his calculation. She'd just revealed something. She'd just let her mask slip for exactly 1 second, and in that second, he'd seen something that made the need to understand her become something darker, something more urgent, something that looked a lot like fear. Thursday grand rounds began at 7 in the morning, the conference room packed with 30 medical students hunched over laptops and notepads, the air thick with the particular anxiety of people who'd never made a mistake in front of an audience. Dr. Whitfield stood at the projector, his jaw angled toward the screen like he was about to deliver something profound. Natalie stood near the back wall, restocking the crash cart that lived in the corner, a small task that kept her hands occupied and her presence invisible, or so she thought. "Let's discuss substandard documentation," Whitfield said, pulling up a patient chart. It was hers. The diabetic crisis from Tuesday, a patient whose blood sugar had plummeted to 42, unconscious, seizing. Natalie had caught it during rounds, ordered the dextrose, stayed with the patient for 2 hours after. The woman had woken up fully alert, grateful, eating crackers by evening. "Notice how the nurse here," Whitfield continued, not using her name, never using her name, documented vitals every 2 hours instead of hourly. Potentially catastrophic oversight. This is what happens when support staff overestimate their clinical judgment. This is what happens when anyone not trained in medicine makes autonomous decisions. The student scribbled. A resident, Torres, who'd been there that night, opened his mouth. Whitfield's eyes found him like a sniper lock. Torres closed his mouth. Natalie set down the crash cart's defibrillator pads with deliberate care. Her fingers didn't tremble. Her face didn't change. She'd been lied about before. She'd been blamed for things she hadn't done. She'd been underestimated by men with credentials and office nameplates, and she was still here, still breathing, still measuring out other people's second chances with steady hands. She turned back to the cart and continued working. But she felt it then, that specific heat in her chest, not anger exactly, something colder. Something that came from watching someone build a narrative out of invented facts, and knowing that lying about small things was practice for lying about bigger ones. 3 days later, at the nurse's station vending machine, Whitfield materialized with his entourage of surgical fellows trailing like remora fish behind a shark. The machine hummed its lonely electronic song as Natalie inserted a dollar bill. The hallway conversation around her evaporated. People could sense certain things without being told, the way animals sense weather changes. "Tell me, Ghost," Whitfield said, loud enough for the entire floor to hear him say it. The nickname. He'd overheard someone use it. Should someone with your limited education really be making clinical judgments on my patients? I mean, you change bedpans. You push pills. Perhaps stick to that. His surgical fellows laughed. Nervous laughter, the kind that comes from people who aren't sure if they're allowed to be hearing this. Natalie pressed the water button. The machine dispensed a bottle with a mechanical whine. She removed it, twisted the cap open, took a single sip. Her jaw muscle tightened once, a small betrayal of the composure she'd spent 15 years perfecting. But that was all. She lowered the bottle, turned, and walked past him without acknowledgement. Her fingers pressed white against the plastic, but her face remained blank as she moved down the hallway. Behind her, Whitfield's laughter died. His fellows exchanged glances. One of them whispered something. She didn't hear it. She didn't need to. She was already 3 floors away, in the stairwell, breathing in the concrete and fluorescent smell of the emergency exit. Friday morning arrived with the kind of clinical precision that hospitals ran on: medications at 8, rounds at 9, lunch breaks at 12. Natalie was charting in the electronic system when Whitfield approached the nursing station with his voice already elevated. A medication order for one of his post-ops. Vancomycin. The patient's chart had been flagged 3 months ago, severe penicillin family allergy, documented in red letters on every page. Doctor, Natalie said, her voice level and quiet, the patient has a documented allergy to penicillin derivatives. Vancomycin crosses. I'm aware of the allergy, Whitfield cut in, his tone suggesting she'd questioned his basic medical knowledge. The allergy is to penicillin specifically, not glycoptides. The chart notes severe reaction to cephalosporins as well, Natalie continued, still quiet, still factual. Cross-reactivity is documented at 15%. We should verify. Are you going to continue to undermine my clinical decisions, or are you going to follow the order? His voice had risen now, and the floor was listening. The way a room listens when something might become memorable. Because I can have security remove you for insubordination. Natalie set down her pen with the precision of someone placing a gun on a table. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes lifted to his, and in that moment, something flickered across her face, not anger, something darker. Something that came from muscle memory of standing in sandstorms with a scalpel in her hand and wounded people bleeding into her boots while mortars landed 200 yards away. Something that came from places where hesitation wasn't professionalism, it was a body bag. Then it was gone. Her face reset to neutral. She stood, turned, and walked away from the nursing station without another word. Behind her, Whitfield's breath came in short, sharp bursts. He'd been trying to break her. He was still trying. She was still not breaking, and that absence of breaking was somehow worse than any response could have been. The stairwell again. Concrete walls. Natalie leaned against them, eyes closed, her chest rising and falling in disciplined patterns. Pain was information. The tremor in her hands was information. The way her shoulders wanted to move forward, the way her mind kept cycling through 17 different things she could say that would end his career in approximately 40 seconds, all of it was data. She was still processing when her phone vibrated. A text from her ex-wife, Danny called. Said his CO was coming stateside. Medevac incoming. Natalie didn't respond. She opened her eyes, straightened, and walked back upstairs. When she returned to the floor 10 minutes later, her face showed nothing at all. The vending machine incident was already becoming a story. Hospital staff had picked it apart and reassembled it, looking for meaning. Whitfield had backed away from her since then, retreating into his office, making phone calls. She could hear the tone of his voice through the walls, that particular register people used when they were calling allies, calling in favors, building something. She didn't care. She was waiting for something else. It came at 2 in the morning on Tuesday, in the percussion of helicopter rotors shaking the entire ER bay. The trauma alert cycled through the overhead speakers before Natalie was even fully conscious of moving toward the bay doors. Medevac incoming. Critical GSWs. The announcement was bland, clinical, but her hands knew something her conscious mind was still catching up to. Natalie was restocking the crash cart, spare airway kits, epinephrine vials, defibrillator pads, medications that people needed when the margin between living and dying could be measured in milliliters. The helicopter appeared in the windows like a massive insect, rotor wash hammering down against the tarmac. Doors opened. The trauma team moved with the choreography of people who'd done this hundreds of times. Stretcher. Oxygen mask. 2 personnel running alongside, hands on the patient, calling out vitals. She caught fragments of the handoff. Ambush in Korengal Valley. 5 gunshot wounds. Special Forces Officer. Captain Joel Morrison, Commanding Officer of 3rd Battalion Operations. The words landed like fragments themselves, small things that cut deep and changed the shape of everything they touched. Morrison. Her son Daniel C.O. The man who'd trained her boy, who'd carried wounded soldiers 3 miles on his own back, who'd called the mothers of deployed personnel on their birthdays to tell them their sons were good soldiers, good men, coming home. The stretcher rushed past her, and for one instant her eyes met the patient's face. Even unconscious, even saturated in blood from 2 chest wounds and something deeper in the abdomen, there was something there, something carved from experience and consequence, something that looked the way it looked when people had seen the worst and still showed up to protect others. Natalie's hands froze on the epinephrine vials. ICU volunteers, the charge nurse called out. "We're taking all hands." Natalie's voice came out steady. "I'm on it. I have the overnight assignment anyway." Not a lie. Not exactly. But not the whole truth either. The truth was something she'd spent 15 years learning not to speak out loud. She scrubbed in. Her hands moved through the ritual, antiseptic soap in warm water, between the fingers, under the nails where bacteria lived in the tiny crevices of old scar tissue. She could see her own hands clearly, and they were someone else's hands. They belonged to someone who'd been trained in what people looked like when they were falling apart, and how to reassemble them. They didn't shake. They'd learned not to shake a long time ago. Morrison was prepped on the surgical table, his torso exposed, the wounds catalogued. The surgical team worked for 6 hours while Natalie stood beside the anesthesia cart, monitoring vitals, anticipating needs. Her voice when she spoke was technical, efficient. O2 sat dropping. Pushing 100% concentration. Pressure at 80/50, patients compensating. Type O available, releasing units 3 through 6. She worked with the seamless competence that made surgeons forget she was there, the way she could anticipate the next move 3 seconds before the surgeon asked for it. It was muscle memory. It was the language she'd spoken before anyone here knew she was fluent in it. Dr. Whitfield watched from the gallery window above, his expression shifting through confusion, then calculation, then something sharper. Something that looked almost like recognition. When Morrison was wheeled to ICU, Natalie checked his chart. Wife listed as emergency contact. 2 daughters. And in the notes, a detail she almost missed, Unit Medic Daniel Hayes, mother lives Philadelphia area. She stared at that line for 7 seconds, then closed the chart. Her hands finally trembled, just for a moment, just enough to know what it felt like to lose control for one instant, but when she looked at Morrison's face, peaceful now in the drug-induced sleep of post-operative sedation, her composure returned like a door closing. She took the night shift on his room personally. No one questioned it. The cardiac monitor screamed at 0300 hours. Natalie was 2 floors down, passing the med station with a fresh unit of O-negative blood, when the alarm cut through the hospital's thick silence. High-pitched. Insistent. Morrison's room. She kept walking. Not her patient anymore. Whitfield had made that abundantly clear during morning rounds, his voice carrying across the unit with surgical precision, emotional involvement, privacy violations, unsuitable for critical cases. The reassignment was already documented. Officially, she was no longer even allowed to enter that room. The covering nurse was handling a post-operative bleed on the surgical floor. 2 flights up. Morrison was alone. Natalie set the blood unit on the nearest counter and moved. The corridor was dark except for the glow of exit signs and the amber haze of nighttime hospital lighting. Her scrubs made almost no sound against the tile. Muscle memory from a different lifetime taught her to move quietly, to take up minimal space, to never announce her presence. The challenge coin in her pocket pressed against her thigh, solid and familiar. She'd carried it for 18 years. Most of the staff had never noticed it, not even when it clinked audibly against the supply cart or the code crash cart. Most people see only what they expect to see. She didn't knock before entering Morrison's room. His skin had taken on the color of wet concrete. Gray. The kind of gray that means inadequate perfusion, oxygen debt accumulating in tissues that should be pink and warm. His jugular veins distended like rope underwater, pulsing with venous congestion. The monitor showed a rate of 128, climbing. His breathing shallow. The oxygen saturation that had been steady at 96% was now dropping, 93, 91, 89. She reached him in 3 strides and pressed her stethoscope against his chest. Muffled. The heart sounds were muffled, as if she were listening through cotton. Distant. That distance meant blood, a lot of it, between the cardiac chambers and the pericardial sac that should have held nothing but a whisper of fluid. His blood pressure was visible in his face now, the way his features had begun to flatten with shock. She could see the veins in his neck, see the distension traveling all the way up to the base of his skull. "Captain," she said quietly. "Morrison. Look at me." His eyes found her. Terrified. Conscious enough to understand what his body was telling him. "Cardiac tamponade," she said. "Blood around your heart. I'm going to fix it." It wasn't a request. It was a promise. The ultrasound machine was in the code cart at the end of the hallway. The procedure kit was locked in the same cart. She was not authorized to access either. The unit policy was explicit, only attending physicians and advanced practice providers could perform pericardiocentesis. A nurse performing this procedure was a scope of practice violation, the exact kind of violation Whitfield was building a file about. The exact kind of charge that could end her career, strip her credentials, destroy the careful invisibility she'd cultivated for 15 years. But Morrison's monitor showed electrical alternans now, the QRS complexes widening and narrowing on the screen like a dying oscillation. His heart was literally beating itself to death inside a sack of blood. In 90 seconds, his blood pressure would drop to the point where his brain began to fail. In 2 minutes, he would arrest. In 3 minutes, he would be dead. She grabbed the ultrasound. The code cart was never truly locked, only the medication drawers were sealed. The procedure kits hung in labeled slots. She pulled the pericardiocentesis tray free and carried both machines back to Morrison's room in 14 seconds. The equipment was cold in her hands, the ultrasound probe familiar in a way that made her muscles recognize the weight before her conscious mind could catch up. Her hands weren't shaking. They were doing what they'd been trained to do. Natalie tore open the kit with one motion and laid out the components: 18-gauge needle, 60-milliliter syringe, lidocaine, sterile field. She swabbed Morrison's skin with chlorhexidine, the smell of it sharp and chemical, cutting through the ambient hospital odor of antiseptic and fluid. The probe went down. On the screen, she saw his heart immediately, a dark beating shape compressed by a crescent-shaped fluid collection. 60 milliliters. Maybe more. The blood had turned that characteristic echo bright as it clotted, darker than fresh blood, which meant it had been accumulating for hours. "This will hurt," she said. "Then it won't." She palpated the angle, found the spot where the 5th intercostal space crossed the mid-axillary line, the landmark burned into muscle memory from 72 combat surgeries performed in fields that had no anesthesia, no sterile technique beyond what could be improvised under fire. Her left hand guided the needle. Her right hand advanced it with the kind of steady pressure that came from holding this exact angle 10,000 times before. The needle went through skin. Through muscle. Through the pericardial membrane with a sensation like puncturing a rubber balloon, a subtle give, a brief resistance, then a sudden release. She connected the syringe. The plunger came back and blood filled the barrel immediately. Dark. Clotted. She withdrew 15 milliliters. 20. 30. 40. With each withdrawal, she felt Morrison's shoulders drop slightly, his breathing begin to ease. The monitor showed his rate slowing, 120. 115, 110. The oxygen saturation climbed back up, 91. 93, 95. The blood pressure began to recover, climbing back out of the shock range where it had been threatening to collapse into irreversibility. 60 milliliters total. The syringe was full. She withdrew the needle and applied pressure with gauze, her movements precise and economical. No wasted motion. No hesitation. The code team would arrive in 90 seconds. They would find Morrison stable. They would find a nurse who had just committed a protocol violation, a scope of practice violation, exactly the kind of violation that would justify everything Whitfield had been building toward. She didn't look at the monitor again. She didn't need to. She could hear the change in the cardiac rhythm, could see it in the way Morrison's face was beginning to pink back up, could feel it in the way his breathing had deepened. The heart was no longer being crushed. The heart was beating. "You're going to be okay," she said. She was disposing of the needle when she heard the elevator doors open down the hallway, heard the rapid footsteps, heard the code team mobilizing. She stepped out of Morrison's room and pulled the door partially closed behind her, walking back toward the med station with the empty procedure kit in her hands. Moving like a nurse who had just been passing through. Moving like someone who had nothing to hide. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Whitfield came through the elevator doors 60 seconds behind the code team, moving with the kind of purpose that came from already being awake, already being dressed, already being aware that something had happened. He went directly to Morrison's room. He stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds, looking at Morrison's stable vitals, at the improvement in oxygen saturation, at the cardiac rhythm that had returned to normal sinus. Looking at the evidence that someone had just saved this man's life in direct violation of every policy Whitfield had used to build his case against Natalie. He didn't come looking for her. He didn't ask who had responded. Instead, he pulled his phone from his pocket before he'd even left Morrison's room. She heard him in the hallway outside, heard his voice drop to something quiet and deadly with purpose. "I need you to call the board members." "Yes, tonight. Because I need them to understand what this facility's liability situation looks like when unauthorized personnel perform surgical procedures." "That's right. I have documentation that this is becoming a pattern." "No, I don't need evidence yet. I need them to understand the scope of the problem." "You'll call them?" "Good." He made 3 more calls before the code team had even finished their assessment of Morrison. Calls to the State Medical Oversight Committee. Calls to a consultant he referred to as that independent reviewer we discussed. Calls to people who had already decided what they would believe. Natalie stood at the med station, her gloved hand still wet with antiseptic, and watched him move through the hallway like a man who had just been handed the weapon he'd been waiting for. He had caught her. Not in a mistake, but in a mercy. Not in negligence, but in the exact kind of competence that threatened him. He was going to use this to destroy her. She needed some Jell-O. By morning, the administrator's office smelled like burnt coffee and fear. The folder on the desk was 2 inches thick. Natalie could see it from the doorway before she was even invited to sit. Dr. Whitfield stood with his arms crossed, his tailored suit sharp enough to draw blood, his face arranged in the expression of a man who had already won. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes," the administrator began, but his voice wavered. He wasn't used to firing people. He wasn't used to making decisions that mattered. "We've received multiple complaints regarding your conduct in the ICU." Natalie said nothing. She stood with her hands at her sides, the posture of someone waiting for orders. Her composure was a wall. Whitfield opened the folder and began reading. Protocol violations that never happened. Incidents with timestamps 3 hours off. Statements from nurses she'd trained, swearing they felt unsafe around her. A resident claiming she'd spoken to him with disrespect. Every complaint was a lie wrapped in a language of institutional concern. "This is a medical facility," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the weight of rehearsal. "We have standards. We have protocols. And you," he paused, letting the silence build. "You decided you were above them." The administrator cleared his throat. "The pericardiocentesis you performed without attending physician presence or authorization." "I saved his life," Natalie said quietly. "You performed a surgical procedure outside your scope of practice," Whitfield corrected, his voice smooth as a blade. "And according to state regulations 12.7.3, any nurse performing invasive procedures without proper authorization constitutes grounds for immediate termination. We've contacted our legal team. If you contest this, we will pursue civil action against you personally." Natalie looked at him then, not with anger, but with the flat assessment of someone measuring a target. For just a moment, the mask slipped. Her eyes went cold and distant, like looking into a well with no bottom. The fluorescent light above Whitfield's head suddenly felt very bright. Then the moment passed. Her face reset. Neutral. Waiting. "Your final paycheck will be mailed," the administrator said, not meeting her eyes. "Security will escort you to collect your belongings. We need your badge and ID before you leave the building." She nodded once. Turned. Walked out. The locker room was empty at 5:08 on a Thursday morning. Her space was small, she'd never accumulated much. A spare scrub top. A water bottle. A book she'd started and never finished. The tarnished challenge coin lived in a hidden pocket of her wallet, wrapped in tissue paper like something that might break. Natalie removed it slowly. The coin was heavier than it looked, about the size of a $50, its surface worn smooth by decades of hands. The symbols carved into its face meant nothing to civilians, they looked abstract, decorative, meaningless. But every operator who'd ever earned one knew exactly what they represented. Leadership. Sacrifice. The kind of loyalty that required burying parts of yourself that the rest of the world never got to see. Her hands began to shake. Not from fear. From restraint. From the effort of not throwing the coin across the room, not screaming, not tearing apart everything that represented the institution that had just decided she was worth destroying. Her hands trembled with the sheer force of her own composure, the way a bridge trembles under the weight of traffic it was designed to hold. She closed her fingers around the coin and pressed it against her chest. 8 years. She'd been a civilian for 8 years, and they'd taken it from her in a morning. 12 hours of exposure to a patient who'd needed her, and they decided she didn't belong. The rain started at dusk and didn't stop. Natalie drove through Philadelphia toward the Veterans Cemetery in Gladwine with her hand steady on the wheel, her jaw set, rain hammering against the windshield like applause. The wipers moved in metronomic rhythm, back and forth, keeping time with something inside her that refused to break. The cemetery gates were supposed to close at sunset, but the groundskeeper knew her. Veterans did that for each other. They recognized something in the way she moved, in the way she didn't ask permission to grieve after visiting hours. She found the grave in the darkness, guided by memory, guided by the kind of navigation system that required no GPS. Section D, Row 19, Plot 6. The stone read, David Hayes, Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, beloved husband and father, 1978 to 2016. Corangle Valley, 2016. A helicopter extraction that came 3 minutes too late. The medic, not her medic, she'd been stateside recovering from surgery, had done everything right and it hadn't mattered. Some patients you couldn't save, no matter how good you were, no matter how much you'd trained the people trying. She knelt on the wet grass and pressed the challenge coin into her palm. I got someone's husband home alive, she whispered. The rain fell on her face and she didn't wipe it away. Captain Morrison. His wife, I don't know her name. But I got him breathing, I got him stable, I sent him home to her. And they made it the reason I don't belong anywhere. The grass was cold beneath her knees. The rain was cold. Her voice was quiet, barely audible above the sound of water on stone. 8 years, David. 8 years I stayed quiet. I followed their rules. I asked for nothing. I just tried to be good at what I'm supposed to do, keeping people alive. And today I was a criminal for it. Today I saved a man's life and lost everything. She stayed until the groundskeeper found her at dawn, the coin pressed between her palms like a prayer. He didn't speak, just stood at a distance until she was ready, then walked her back to her car. That was the way of it. Veterans understood that some grief didn't need words. 1 week passed like a holding breath. 7 days without purpose. Without the rhythm of the night shift, without the particular mathematics of ICU work, counting hours, counting milliliters, counting the moments between crisis and stability. Natalie's apartment became a smaller world. She woke at irregular hours, slept at stranger ones. She didn't check her email. She didn't answer calls from numbers she didn't recognize. The challenge coin sat on her kitchen table, no longer hidden. She couldn't bring herself to put it away again. The abstract symbols on its face seemed to grow clearer in the light of day, as if they were trying to tell her something she wasn't ready to understand. On the 7th day, she drove back to Riverside Community Hospital to return her badge. The parking lot was ordinary, people coming and going, cars moving in and out, the machinery of institutional life grinding forward without her. The rain had passed. The sky was the color of old metal. She was halfway across the asphalt when the black SUVs came through the gates. 3 of them, moving in formation, their trajectory suggesting they knew exactly where they were going. Behind them came a military transport truck, olive drab and purposeful. Personnel spilled out before the vehicles had fully stopped, soldiers in dress uniforms, their movements synchronized, their bearing the particular straightness that came from decades of discipline. Natalie froze. A Marine colonel stepped down from the lead SUV, his uniform creased hard enough to cut, his eye scanning the entrance to the emergency department with the focus of someone conducting a reconnaissance. Behind him came a formation of 6 personnel, and then, moving with the precision of ceremonial movement, a 2-star general. The general was wearing medals like a history book. Silver stars. Bronze stars. Purple hearts stacked against his chest like evidence. Natalie stood in the middle of the parking lot and understood, in the way that certain things become suddenly and completely clear, that her war had found her. The colonel turned and saw her standing there. For a moment, just a moment, something registered in his face. Recognition. Confirmation. But he kept walking. He had orders. He had an announcement to make. He crossed the entrance to Riverside Community Hospital and his voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of official sanction and the force of something that could not be stopped. "I'm looking for Lieutenant Commander Sandstorm," he announced to the reception desk. The waiting room went still. 3 black SUVs rolled up to Riverside Community's emergency entrance like a statement. The kind of arrival that doesn't ask permission, it takes the whole parking lot. Boots on marble. 1, 2, 3, 4. A Marine colonel walked through the automatic doors as if they'd been waiting for him specifically, and maybe they had. His uniform carried the weight of command the way most people carry briefcases. The reception desk staff froze. The waiting room held its breath. "I'm looking for Lieutenant Commander Sandstorm," he announced to the lobby, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, low, steady, capable of moving mountains if required. "She works here. I need her location within the next 60 seconds. The fluorescent lights buzzed. A monitor beeped somewhere distant. Nobody moved. Then Captain Morrison whispered from his wheelchair in the corner, his voice carrying the reverent soldier's reserve for legends they've watched survive the unsurvivable. "Sandstorm. That's what we called her downrange." He looked at the gathered staff, at the confusion blooming across their faces. "That's Natalie. Lieutenant Commander Natalie Hayes. That's who you're looking for." The room didn't just go silent. It seemed to compress, every person suddenly aware they'd been standing next to someone they fundamentally misunderstood. A nurse who'd pushed a crash cart 3 nights a week was actually someone commanding officers flew across the country to salute. The colonel's eyes moved to the back hallway where Natalie stood, perfectly still, her hands at her sides, watching this moment unfold with the calm of someone who'd already survived worse. The Marine approached her with a file folder thick as a medical textbook. His movements held the precision of 30 years of service compressed into purpose. When he spoke, each word landed with the weight of official documentation. Lieutenant Commander Natalie Elizabeth Hayes. Current rank, Special Operations Medical Command. During your deployment to Coincidental Valley between 2009 and 2011, you conducted 72 combat surgeries under fire in a forward operating base with no surgical staff, no blood bank, and no evacuation helicopter within 20 minutes. He opened the file. His eyes never left hers. You trained 147 Special Forces medics in advanced trauma protocols. 47 of those medics are currently deployed. 23 are attached to this man's unit. He nodded toward Morrison. Of the 214 soldiers you trained, 0 were lost to preventable battlefield deaths. 0. Morrison's hand moved to his chest. His jaw tightened. Around him, the hospital staff began to understand what they were actually witnessing, not an error correction, but a resurrection. The doors at the far end of the lobby opened. A 2-star general entered, dress uniform creased sharp enough to draw blood, decorations catching the fluorescent light like small mirrors. She crossed the marble floor and stopped directly in front of Natalie. Then she saluted. Not a casual acknowledgement. A full military salute, fist to chest, arm extended, held with the ceremonial weight of recognition. The general's hand remained raised, sustained, deliberate. Every eye in the lobby tracked the gesture. The salute was a language, and what it said was, *, you belong in a rank higher than mine in this moment. *. When she lowered her hand, the general's voice emerged clear and measured. Silver Star for extraordinary heroism. 2 Bronze Stars for valor. Your medical innovations under field conditions have been integrated into NATO trauma protocols. She produced a leather case containing medals that caught light like accusations. You've earned recognition from the Pentagon. Instead, you've been terminating a career by people who didn't understand who they were firing. Then Dr. Whitfield stepped forward, his mouth already moving, his face the color of old clay. Now wait. Wait. There are protocols here. Scope of practice violations that. Morrison's voice cut through like a scalpel. He sat in that wheelchair, still recovering from 5 bullet wounds, and his presence suddenly dominated the room the way Morrison had commanded soldiers from Coincidental to Kandahar. She saved my life twice. His eyes moved between the gathered staff and Whitfield. Once in this hospital, and once when she trained my medic well enough that he kept me breathing until the chopper came. My platoon medic learned field surgery from her. He paused. That medic kept 4 of us alive on a mountain where I'm supposed to be dead. So Dr. Whitfield, you can shut down about protocols. Protocols are what the people who've never seen a real crisis hide behind. The room absorbed that. Whitfield's mouth opened. Closed. His hands moved at his sides like he was trying to grab something solid that kept evaporating. Then Ron Chen appeared from the stairwell, a USB drive in his hand and the quiet authority of someone who'd spent 3 days watching everything he needed to watch. He was a Navy veteran who'd served as a hospital IT specialist, which meant he'd recognized what Whitfield was doing the moment it started. While the rest of the hospital moved forward, Chen had been preserving evidence with the methodical patience of someone who understood corruption followed predictable patterns. Sir, he addressed the general directly, offering the drive. You need to see this. All of this? The general accepted the drive with the kind of attention usually reserved for classified intelligence, because that's essentially what it was. Chen's voice stayed level, factual, the way military people speak when they're delivering casualty reports. 0430 hours, 6 nights ago, Dr. Whitfield accessed the hospital's video archive system. The access was logged from his personal credentials. Chen walked toward the conference room, the general following, Morrison wheeling behind them, Natalie moving with the precise calm of a surgeon entering an operating theater. He deleted 187 minutes of security footage from the ICU hallway during Lieutenant Commander Hayes' emergency procedure on Captain Morrison. Then he accessed the medical records database and modified the timestamps on the pericardiocentesis documentation, attempting to reclassify the procedure as occurring outside the accepted emergency window. The general's face didn't move. She'd clearly seen this before. Careers ending. Officers trying to rewrite what couldn't be rewritten. The conference room screen flickered. Then video. Timestamped video. 0:26 hours, Natalie moving with surgical precision, her hand steady as a laser, withdrawing blood from around Morrison's heart while the monitor screened its warning. 0:28 hours, the code team arriving, finding Morrison stabilized, already breathing easier. 0:430 hours, Whitfield entering the hallway with his phone in hand, seeing Natalie emerge from the room, his expression changing from curiosity to something darker. Then the camera followed Whitfield to his office. Him at his computer. His fingers moving. Files appearing and disappearing. The ultrasound images from Morrison's procedure, perfect images, demonstrating textbook execution of emergency medicine, being queued for deletion. But the files never actually left the system. Chen had diverted them to a backup drive 30 seconds before Whitfield's command took effect. Every frame of attempted erasure was itself recorded. Every timestamp modification logged. Every second of Dr. Whitfield's careful sabotage documented in excruciating detail. The room didn't just absorb that information. The room understood, in the space of those video frames, that everything was different now. That Natalie's termination wasn't an administrative action, it was the manufactured result of a calculated setup designed to destroy a witness to Whitfield's own incompetence. That Morrison's emergency hadn't been a crisis that justified her removal. It had been the crisis that Whitfield had allowed to happen, hoping her intervention would give him legal cover for firing her afterward. Whitfield had tried to weaponize her competence. Instead, he documented his own premeditated sabotage. The general watched the video twice. Then she stood and made a phone call that took exactly 90 seconds. By the time she finished, State Medical Board investigators were already en route. The FBI had been given reason to examine 8 years of Dr. Whitfield's personnel decisions. The hospital's legal team was beginning to understand that they'd been handed a liability the size of a malpractice settlement. Natalie stood perfectly still through all of it. Her composure never wavered. Not when the Marine colonel had announced her rank. Not when the general had saluted her. Not when Morrison had described her training the medics who kept him alive. Not when the video played, frame by frame, showing Whitfield's attempt to delete evidence of her life-saving work. The general turned to her and spoke with the clarity of someone used to being obeyed. "Lieutenant Commander, you're vindicated. Full investigation into hospital procedures, restitution for wrongful termination, and reinstatement with back pay is being processed through proper channels as we speak. Captain Morrison's medical team has cleared his medical discharge. Your son's unit will be briefed on what his mother's actually been doing for the past 15 years. Natalie's jaw shifted slightly. One micro-movement. That was all. She looked at Ron Chen and nodded, a gesture of recognition that contained more respect than 100 formal commendations. He'd seen what happened and decided to preserve it. That choice had just ended Whitfield's career and restored hers. Behind her, Morrison's unit was arriving through the lobby doors, 23 soldiers in dress uniforms, moving with the controlled precision of an honor guard. They formed 2 lines down the center of the marble floor, creating a corridor of recognition. Not for a fallen soldier. For the officer who'd trained their medics. For the woman who'd fought a battle nobody knew about in a hospital hallway at 3 in the morning. Whitfield backed away from the general's stare. His hands moved. His mouth tried words. Nothing landed. He was watching his entire institutional power structure collapse in real time, his board connections suddenly unreturning calls, his manufactured complaints dissolving under military scrutiny, his deletion attempts preserved in HD video for state investigators. The man who tried to erase Natalie's service had instead erased his own future. By week's end, his medical license would be suspended pending investigation. By month's end, a pattern would emerge: 17 years of falsified records, retaliation against competent staff, surgical errors systematically blamed on nurses to protect his own reputation. The investigation would expand. His network would fragment. Every ally would remember an urgent appointment elsewhere. But that wasn't for tonight. Tonight was for Natalie walking through the honor corridor her son's unit had created. Tonight was for Morrison watching the woman who'd trained his medics being acknowledged in a room full of people finally understanding who she actually was. Tonight was for the general placing the leather case containing the silver star and 2 bronze stars directly into Natalie's hands and saying, "Welcome back, Lieutenant Commander." For the first time in a week, since that night she'd knelt at her husband's grave in the rain, Natalie's composure shifted. Not broke. Shifted. A single breath that seemed to carry the weight of everything she'd carried silently. Competence without recognition. Heroism without mention. A career that had been erased right up until the moment someone with authority decided it couldn't be erased anymore. She accepted the medals and looked at Morrison. "Your medic did good work out there." "He learned from the best," Morrison said. She nodded once. That was all the acknowledgement that was needed between people who'd survived the unsurvivable. Everything else was just paperwork catching up to reality. Subscribe to see what happened when Natalie walked back into Riverside Community Hospital 6 months later, vindicated but fundamentally changed, teaching the next generation of combat medics while Dr. Whitfield checked badges at the very same entrance. Like and comment if you think institutional corruption should cost you your entire career. And let me know, if your workplace made you invisible, would you fight to prove them wrong, or would you just walk away?